Before her was the cityscape of New York, across the river from New Jersey, where she was. As she looked out, a plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center complex. It was the morning of September 11th, 2001, 24 years ago. The death and destruction were unthinkable. Our nation went through collective trauma. For more than 2 weeks, the only laugh that I heard came from a toddler who lived next door to my home. He did not know about the incident, and the distant sound of his joy came to me as a relief from the terrible news about what had happened. For Lisa, though, this was even more traumatic. As she watched the airplane crash into the North Tower, she almost fainted. Her husband was in that building, and he did not survive. Lisa relived that moment with me 20 years later. I was her grief counselor. At the hospice I worked at, I served as both a chaplain and a grief counselor. I was a minister, and besides having a Master of Divinity degree, I also had a Master of Science in Counseling with board certification. I was qualified to do both roles together. Lisa was not speaking with me only because her husband had died 20 years earlier. She was dealing with the recent death of her father in his late 80s. The grief that she experienced over the last remaining parent, combined with memories of her mother's and husband's death earlier. The grief she felt was complicated and cumulative. Lisa had worked through the trauma of her husband's death, and she was in a very good relationship with another man. She thought she had moved past it all, yet there it was again, brought out by her father's recent death. Today is All Souls' Day in many liturgical calendars. It is a time when prayers are said for the ordinary people who have died. All Saints' Day was yesterday in other faith traditions, a time to revere the holy people in some traditions who exemplified virtues or led the faithful. In the Unitarian Universalist context, there is little connection to saints as in other religious traditions, though we do have several congregations in our tradition that were named a long time ago for Christian saints. However, churches named All Souls are more common and include some of the largest congregations in our larger movement. It seems likely that the congregations named All Souls in our faith tradition meant more commonly all people. All Souls today comes to us in a time of year when it is clear that the summer is over. The leaves have changed color and are falling. The nights are becoming longer. We can acknowledge that the world in the Northern Hemisphere seems to be preparing for the long sleep of winter. It is a time when it seems that the shadows are longer. It seems that the world, while still beautifully colored, is readying for the death, as nature appears, of the winter season. Some of the ancient peoples of Northern Europe believed that a door opened at this time of year between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Some called it Samhain. It is a time when the spirits of the dead interact with the living, presenting themselves at the homes of their kin. I don't know if I could believe in Samhain, but I do wish that I could interact again with the people I love who have died, even if only briefly. Another side, though, is that it would be difficult to know that the person lived in a different world and that we would be separated. Perhaps they would be able to see us, but we would not see them. My grandmother Smith, a conservative Southern Baptist, as if there's any other kind, believed in heaven She also believed that those in heaven could watch the lives of the living and would know when their beloved friends and family were dying and would assemble to greet them in the afterlife. She never said that explicitly, but when she was on hospice, she told me a story about a time in our lives when I was a toddler, and she watched me from afar. Our very dysfunctional family sent my parents and I went to the same church as my grandparents. But my father had a feud with his parents, and even though we were in the same church and I knew who my grandmother was, he would not permit me to speak to her. So I saw her as I was passing her in the hallways and tried to reach out for her. I was 3 years old at the time. That was how my grandmother was trying to tell me that we would be separate, but still be connected. She didn't say that explicitly, but I knew she was telling me that story of being present, but being unable to touch for a reason. These are some of the many religious views of death. But it isn't death that we are to deal with on All Souls Day. It's grief. Humans have finite existence. Whether when you're dead, or you go to another place, or you're presented with a new life in some way, as Buddhists and Hindus believe. We cannot know. We have stories across religions, and many of them. And if I were to poll you, I suspect that I would find many different versions of what happens when we die. Even if religious belief in an afterlife is part of your faith, you still grieve and deal with separation. Each of us experiences this grief, and it never goes completely away. The woman I counseled, Lisa, knew that her grief would always be there. She loved deeply. She knew also that what she sought was not closure, but adaptation to the grief she felt. The trauma of the death of her husband on September 11th would always be there, and she had adapted to it, found a new life with a man she loved. Was she over it? Never. She had to add another death into the world and revisit her other griefs. So what is needed to deal with grief? I think that one of the most important things is to adapt to grief as someone you can be a mess around. This might be a friend, a family member, significant other, or psychological or religious professional. With a deep grief, it is important to let it out around someone who can bear it. Everyone cannot. Some people just do not feel comfortable with expressions of grief. In some cultures, it just isn't acceptable to express grief. In 1979, the then Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, now King Charles III of Great Britain, spoke at the funeral of his great uncle, Lord Mountbatten. Mountbatten had been a strong surrogate grandfather to the young royal. And in speaking at his uncle's funeral, Prince Charles cried a little bit, though he kept, as British would expect it, a mostly stiff upper lip. However, the British public thought that the heir to the throne was mentally insane. How could anyone cry at a funeral? It just wasn't done. One of the ways that some people today in our country are comfortable with grief is the feeling that grief should only be for a brief period. So not unlike the British public with displays of grief, some of us believe there's a limit to the time that one should grieve. You should set your calendar accordingly. It is so American to set a schedule for grieving, for appropriate grieving. It doesn't work like that. Grief is something that comes and goes. In my own life, I have experienced delayed grief. These were times when someone died and I could not grieve immediately. There was a movie with Deborah Winger a long time ago, and Shirley MacLaine as her mother. I cannot remember the name of the movie. I thought that was what it was, but I wasn't. I forgot to look it up. And in the end, I'll give this away to you. Deborah Winger's character dies, and her son does not grieve. He's just a boy. He's delaying the grief. He will grieve one day, but he walks away from it and wants to go out and do something. It's not that he isn't grieving. He just can't deal with the grief right now. He's delayed. Sometimes delayed grief is about being around people with sharing, being uncomfortable sharing emotions, or traveling or worrying that family members would say inappropriate things if I showed how I felt. At other times, the grief for me has taken time to percolate through my spirit and came as a surprise. One can be unaware of how deeply one feels until the emotion comes out. We aren't always aware of the emotions that are deep inside us. They come out in the times when we don't want them, but they are there. This happened to me with a family member who was distant with everyone else, but with whom I grew closer the last 20 years of her life. 15 years of her life. Without fully realizing the bond that we had. The grief came as a surprise because the relationship was not extremely close, I thought. But we had connected not as family in the way that the roles or expectations are of one another. This meant that we had few expectations of each other and could be with each other as much as friends, as family. And that was why this grief was delayed. Because I was confused about who I was grieving and my own feelings. This reminds us that grief is personal, and it is often unique in its expression. It is possible to grieve differently with every loss. It is possible to feel something different with the loss of a relative, a friend, a cat or dog. And don't get me on grieving for pets. It's still there. Grief does not need to conform to a set pattern. Each person expresses, feels, or interprets grief differently at times. On All Souls Day, we acknowledge that grief is still with us. We do not express it openly all the time, but we also know that it remains. We adapt to it. We revisit it sometimes when we experience the deaths of those we love, or are reminded of their absence. Mary Oliver, the poet, tells us to let it go. But that is not completely possible. Perhaps she means the delusion that things will go on as before, or an obsessive grief that overpowers one's life. There is, after all, the necessity to discover a new life as we integrate our grief. If grief controls us, then we might need to seek help. As for Lisa, we spoke every week for 4 months. During that time, she sought a grief support group in her town. Being an Italian American, she sought first grief support from her local Roman Catholic churches. But no open grief groups were meeting in July and August. She happened upon a grief support group for African American Baptist women. and they let a Roman Catholic, Italian-American woman join them. She told me that the women she met with carried a lot of grief, and that their culture gave them the strength to bear it better than she did when she joined the group. Her own grief changed through listening to them, encountering them, and she learned a different perspective on life and suffering than the one she probably would have experienced in the religious community to which she belonged. She found a new way through and knew that her grief would subside. We Unitarian Universalists do not talk about death and grief as much as other religious traditions do. Someone wrote that religion is about having to be born, to live, and also having to die. We as a religious tradition do not speculate much about what happens when we die. Our Unitarian Universalist heritage is one that emphasizes how we live, what we do to make the world better. Many other religions deal primarily with death and the afterlife and other forms of existence. We tend to focus on living, being, and doing. Our Unitarian heritage, our Unitarian literary heritage of the 19th century, those spoke passionately of grief. All that one need do is read about the death of Ralph Waldo Emerson's son to know that grief was present. Henry W. Longfellow soldiered on after the horrible death of his wife. And though he still moved forward, those who knew him said that he was never the same. That was true for Louisa May Alcott, who wrote of death befalling one of the girls in Little Women. Our Universalist heritage acknowledged grief as an inalienable reality of human existence. They did not dwell upon it, though, because they held that all souls eventually went to heaven. This belief in universal salvation freed them to focus their energies on living rather than fearing God's judgment. In speaking of death and grief on All Souls Sunday, we acknowledge the truth of human existence. We acknowledge that living is hard. We acknowledge that one of the reasons our church exists is to give mutual support for one another in grief and suffering. Even in the face of hardship, there remains love. For that and so many reasons, may we be truly grateful. In faith, in hope, in love. Amen.